Our third panel is chaired by Dr. Burton Folsom. He is a native of Lincoln, Nebraska, and received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. He's written 6 books, including Myth of the Robber Barons, now in its 6th edition. This year, he co-authored a 7th book, FDR Goes to War, which has just been released by Simon & Schuster. FDR Goes to War is a sequel to his best-selling book, New Deal or Raw Deal, which came out in 2008. New Deal or Raw Deal has had an impact on the thinking in this country, in part because of Hillsdale College's new Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies in Washington, D.C. In 2008, the Kirby Center sponsored a lecture by Burt to leaders in the media from radio, television, and newspaper. During that lecture, Burt read the quote from FDR's Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, in 1939, and Morgenthau was referring to government spending on so-called stimulus projects. And Morgenthau said, "We have tried spending money and it does not work." Because of the exposure that the Kirby Center could give Burt's lecture, and this was just a few weeks after the book originally came out, within a matter of days, that quote was on programs and in print all over the country. Soon, a librarian at the Library of Congress called Burt to ask the specific location of the quote because they were swamped with phone calls asking for the citation. Burt referred them to the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York, because that quote is in Henry Morgenthau's papers, and he made it in a committee meeting with the leader of the House Ways and Means Committee and quite another other politicians of the day. And Morgenthau's diary and private papers are at the FDR Library on microfilm. Burt has posted a link to the Morgenthau papers with that quote on his website at burtfolsom.com. Along with many other aspects of World War II, now the new book, FDR Goes to War, it covers the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and organized labor during World War II. So this is very timely for the topic of this panel, which is the debate over public sector unions. Please welcome Burt Folsom.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita. And she, of course, was my co-author with FDR Goes to War. She wrote half the book and was a big help. You know, I wrote this big tax chapter. I was so proud because it was showing how Franklin Roosevelt had raised the income tax after withholding. He introduced withholding in 1943, the tax rate on millionaires was up to a person earning $1 million had to pay a tax of $1,006,750. Which is why I'm more optimistic than some of our previous speakers, because we certainly have improved from that point. And I think we can today. When I had that chapter, though, I showed it to Anita, and I was thinking she'd be all impressed, at least I was hoping, is my co-author, and she very gently said, "I think we can do without the first 5 pages." And I was shocked, and I was even more shocked to discover that we could and did. She had it starting at exactly the right point and saying the right thing. So I thank Anita for that and for the introduction and for the insight into why, when you have academic speakers up here giving speeches, you have to have time limits or they might go over the limit. In case you wonder where Anita might have gotten that wild concept that something like that might happen, I might just refer you to our marriage of 32 years. Well, we have a great session today on public sector unions, and I'm excited to be chairman of the panel and introducing as our first speaker. I will introduce them individually. As our first speaker, a colleague of mine at Hillsdale College in the history department, Paul Marino. And Paul Marino is the William and Bernice Grucock Chair in the American Constitution. And he's the Dean of Faculty also at Hillsdale College. He earned his doctorate under Herman Bells at the University of Maryland in 1994. Paul has written 2 books. The first, From Direct Action to Affirmative Action, Fair Employment Law and Policy in America. His second book, which I've read and is a great book, Black Americans and Organized Labor, A New History. Both of these books published by LSU Press. Paul has written on labor history for the Wall Street Journal, as well as for many other professional journals. How many of you, in fact, saw Paul's op-ed Monday in the Wall Street Journal? I see a lot of you. You might Google it. It was one of the most referred to articles that came out this week, and it's on Franklin Roosevelt and how he demonized business and used that politically, and of course making some parallels for that for today. Paul had that article in the Wall Street Journal Monday. He made an appearance on Fox News on Tuesday and discussed it before a larger audience there. It was an excellent presentation. They showed pictures of Roosevelt and smiling and business being taxed heavily, and it was an excellent presentation. Paul has taught at Hillsdale College for 12 years. He's held visiting professorships at Princeton University and the University of Paris School of Law. Paul and his wife, Lisa, have 4 children. And by the way, they're excellent bridge players. Let me please welcome Paul Marino.
Thank you very much, Bert. That was wonderful, but I am a very mediocre bridge player. I wish I were excellent. Thank you. I'd like to thank Hillsdale College and the Acton Institute and the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to talk to you today in addition to our web audience. Public sector unionism represents the third period in the history of organized labor in America. Public unions have recently, I think it was in 2010, overtaken private unions in total membership. Private unions only became a major force in the American economy with the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, of 1935. Before that, most employment in America was completely at will, or individual, or voluntary. I have some background of these earlier periods in my full paper, but to save time, I'd like to get to the post-Wagner Act period and the public sector union part of the story more directly. But first, about the Wagner Act. In a nutshell, what the Wagner Act did was it required employers to bargain collectively with any organization chosen by a majority of their employees. These are the basic principles of the Act: compulsory unionism and majority unionism. It was an unabashedly pro-union measure. It outlawed a host of unfair labor practices by employers, but none by unions. Although the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 tried to restore some balance to the law, it still maintained the compulsory and majority principles of the Wagner Act. The most important change that the Taft-Hartley Act made was Section 14B, which allowed states to enact what are called right-to-work laws. And over the course of time, industries relocated from Wagner Act or union shop states to right-to-work states. Even more than the competition of right-to-work states, the rise of global competition in the late 20th century is the principal reason for the decline of private sector unionism. Quite simply, they priced themselves out of the market or killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. And today we find that private sector unions are back to the level that they were about 100 years ago, less than 10% of the private sector workforce. Now, Section 2 of the Wagner Act explicitly exempted public employees from its coverage. Congress declared that the United States, states, and political subdivisions of states were not employers under the terms of the Act. Many of you may be familiar with the letter that President Roosevelt wrote to the President of the Federation of Federal Employees in 1937, in which he explained why this must be. Roosevelt said, "All government employees should realize that the process of collective bargaining, as usually understood, cannot be transplanted into the public service. It has its distinct and insurmountable limitations when applied to public personnel management. The very nature and purposes of government make it impossible for administrative officials to represent fully or to bind the employer in mutual discussions with government employee organizations. The employer is the whole people who speak by means of laws enacted by their representatives in Congress. Accordingly, administrative officials and employees alike are governed and guided, and in many instances restricted, by laws which establish policies, procedures, or rule in personnel matters." Now, the crucial phrases that Roosevelt uses are the very nature and purposes of government and his definition of the employer as the whole people which speaks by means of laws. That is to say, the government is sovereign, and this is the fundamental difference between public sector and private sector unionism. Public unions began much as private unions did, as voluntary associations that tried to improve the working conditions of their members. A century ago, they were especially prominent among postal workers, since the post office was one of the few large-scale federal services. In the first decade of the 20th century, Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft recognized the danger of these federal employee organizations lobbying Congress and issued executive orders prohibiting federal employee membership in such organizations. Organized labor leaders and historians have condemned these orders as gag rules and limitations on free speech. But Theodore Roosevelt was hardly a reactionary, and consider what another eminent progressive, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, said when he upheld a Massachusetts law that prohibited police officers from soliciting contributions to political organizations. Holmes said, "The petitioner may have a constitutional right to talk politics, but he has no constitutional right to be a policeman." Congress overturned these executive orders in the 1912 Lloyd-La Follette Act. Notably, the La Follette, in this case, was Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, and Wisconsin was the seedbed of many progressive initiatives, and that of union empowerment especially. As we'll see, Wisconsin became the first state to promote public employee unions. But this law was limited only to post office employees. It did not establish collective bargaining or the right to strike, but merely the freedom to petition Congress. And there was no significant extension of federal employee organization rights until the 1960s. The decisive episode in public sector unionism was the 1919 Boston police strike. The public reaction to this strike probably set back public sector unionism several decades. No public service better underscored the sovereign nature of government than the police. The federal equivalent would be to allow the soldiers and sailors of the Army or Navy to form unions. And this is not as far-fetched as it sounds, as Norway and Germany today allow Army unions. We might have avoided World War II if that had been mandated in the Treaty of Versailles. This strike made a national hero of Calvin Coolidge, who succinctly explained that there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. President Woodrow Wilson also called the strike an intolerable crime against civilization. Today, the American left is chagrined that liberal Democrats like Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York have taken tough stands against state employee unions, but this is nothing new. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York City did the same in the 1940s when the city took over the subways and 26,000 members of the Transport Workers Union became public employees. Mayor John Lindsay later took a similar stance in the 1970s until New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller undercut him. By the 1950s, public opinion had become more open to the prospect of public labor unions. Private sector unions began to decline in relative terms in the mid-1950s, and they had become much less radical, less prone to strike, and less prone to violence when they did strike. The expansion of business in the right-to-work states of the South and the West made union leaders more cautious. Above all, there was tremendous growth in the public sector workforce. Nearly 9 million by 1962, or 1 out of every 8 workers in the country. This proportion would reach nearly 1 in 5, or 18% by 1970. The American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees led the effort to get a state to allow public employee unionization. This is AFSCME. And they originated in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin took the lead in pro-union legislation. New York City actually preceded Wisconsin with similar legislation in 1958, and many other states and cities followed. The federal government followed when President Kennedy signed Executive Order 10988 in 1962. This order permitted federal employees to form unions and bargain collectively, though it did not grant the right to bargain over wages, which remained under Congress's control, or the right to strike. These unions also could not compel federal employees to join, and they cannot strike. This order was strengthened by President Nixon and finally given a statutory basis by Congress in the Civil Service Act of 1978. With these new federal and state policies in place, the numbers of public employee members swelled rapidly from 400,000 to 4 million by 1970. This was largely because many public employees were already organized. Old professional associations simply became labor unions. The National Education Association, for example, had been formed in 1857 as the National Teachers Association. It had regarded itself as a professional association, much like the American Bar Association or the American Medical Association. But when it faced the trade unionism of the American Federation of Teachers, AFL-CIO, it had to convert to a union or die. And the NEA today is the largest labor union in the United States, but it still remains unaffiliated with the AFL-CIO. When the Wagner Act promoted private sector unionization in the 1930s, the principal justification for the act was that it would promote industrial peace and facilitate interstate commerce. It actually had the opposite effect, producing more strikes and greater labor militancy in 1937. State and federal encouragement of public sector bargaining had a similar and even greater impact. Unprecedented strikes by teachers, garbage collectors, postal workers, and others became common in the late 1960s and 1970s, despite the fact that every state prohibited strikes by public employees. The issue reached a crisis point in the mid to late 1970s. AFSCME pushed Congress to force all the states to recognize public employee unions and to give public employee unions even greater powers than private sector unions enjoy. The push was for what was called a National Public Employment Relations Law, which was called a Wagner Act for Public Employees. And this effort was led by Representative William Clay of Missouri. His son, William Clay Jr., holds the same seat in Congress today. While the prospects for public employee unionism seemed bright, there were also foreboding signs. AFSCME had begun to arouse resentment from other union federations, the AFL-CIO and the Service Employees International Union especially. AFSCME's president, a man named Jerry Worth, was notably abrasive and became an easy target for his opponents. He said, for example, that police and firefighter unions should let our cities burn if they didn't get what they demanded. And this phrase became the title of a book by Ralph de Toledano. But most of all, the disruptive and illegal strikes of the period, like the sit-down strikes of the 1930s, began to turn public opinion against public unions. The Supreme Court began to get cold feet about this matter of public employee unionization. In March of 1976, it decided that Congress could not extend the Fair Labor Standards Act to state employees. Justice Harry Blackmun, a recent Nixon appointee, was the swing vote in this 5-4 decision. For the first time since the New Deal, the court had recognized a limit on Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. The court recognized the fact that, quote, the states as states stand on a quite different footing from an individual or a corporation. This decision, its title was the National League of Cities versus Usury, took the wind out of the sails of public employee unionism. It may have prevented the United States from going the way of Great Britain or Italy in the late 1970s. And one of the reasons why this decision was so important was that it preserved the principle that's often referred to as competitive federalism. It was very much like Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act, which permitted states to prohibit compulsory private sector unionism. That enabled employers to move from union shop states like New York or Michigan to open shop or right-to-work states like Texas or Georgia. But if the government of New York State or New York City faces costly public sector unions, those governments can't just move to Texas. But their tax-paying residents can. And the National Public Employees Relation Act would have made this impossible and imported New York-style public sector unionism to the entire country. And this Supreme Court decision made that impossible. The reaction to the costs of public unions helped revive conservative movements in the 1970s and 1980s, electing Margaret Thatcher in 1979 in Britain and Ronald Reagan here in 1980. The defeat of the National Public Employment Relations Act was decisive, but since it involved complicated and technical legislative and judicial doctrines and maneuvers, it was overshadowed by the dramatic confrontation of Ronald Reagan and the air traffic controllers in 1981. Ironies abound in this episode. Reagan had been not only a union member, but the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He had also signed California's 1968 law permitting public employee unionization. The professional air traffic controllers, PATCO they're called, had endorsed Reagan in the 1980 election. But when their demands were not met, the union decided to play hardball. They took the advice of Representative Clay, who made the following statement to the 1980 PATCO convention. Clay told them, "Your plan must be one which completely revises your political thinking. It should start with the premise that you have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. It must be selfish and pragmatic. You must learn the rules of the game and learn them well. Rule number one says that you don't put the interest of any other group ahead of your own. What's good for the federal employees must be interpreted as being good for the nation. Rule number 2 says that you take what you can and you give up only what you must. Rule number 3 says that you take it from whomever you can, whenever you can, however you can. If you are not prepared to play by these rules of the game, then you have not reached the age of political maturity. The title of this conference is Markets, Government, and the Common Good, and there isn't much of a sense of the common good in these comments by Representative Clay. We might call this the Malian dialogue of the PATCO strike. It exposed just the utter selfishness of public employee unions. And it makes it easy to understand why Reagan was able to take the strong stand that he did by firing and replacing the striking air traffic controllers, and why the publicly overwhelmingly supported him in this. The PATCO strike is invariably depicted as a replay of the 1919 Boston police strike. Reagan, after all, had taken down FDR's portrait in the Oval Office and replaced it with one of Calvin Coolidge. PATCO, the interpretation usually goes, was the opening salvo of the Republicans' campaign to repeal the New Deal, destroying organized labor in order to redistribute income from Main Street to Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. But breaking the PATCO strike had approximately zero impact on public sector unionism. It may have cooled public unionists' willingness to strike, but their numbers continued to flourish. In the 1980s, state employment grew 20%, or twice the rate of the population. The number of public employee union members has grown over 25% in the last 25 years, keeping pace with the growth of population, and becoming a majority, as I said, of all union members last year. The PATCO replacement workers soon joined a new union, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, which carried on PATCO's work. The failure to reverse public sector unionism, indeed the failure even to attempt it, is another indication of how limited the impact of the so-called Reagan Revolution was in domestic affairs. But it's also often said that Reagan's breaking of the PATCO strike sent a signal to private sector employers that it was now acceptable to take a hard line against their unions. But this is also very doubtful. The factors responsible for private sector union decline long antedated the PATCO strike and continued after it. I would even argue that Reagan actually helped the public employee union movement. By reviving the private sector economy, he caused public opinion to lose concern about the issue. Public unions do well in flush times, thus their rapid growth in the 1950s and 1960s when the public thinks that they can absorb the costs. And they become unpopular when taxpayers begin to feel the cost of them, as in the 1970s and today. But during the flush times, they add to the cost of government. The government at all levels consumed only 13% of GDP in 1929. That rose to 33% in 1960 and about 45% by the mid-1990s. And we may now face the time when the time may have come when it will be impossible to revive the private economy to absorb the costs of public sector unions. This leads to another point, that defenders of public unions often deny that union-negotiated wages and benefits, even pensions, are responsible for the tremendous state and federal debt and deficits that we were talking about this morning. But the direct costs of public employee unions are only the tip of the iceberg. Consider, for example, the decline in the quality of education along with its increased costs since unionization, the subject of our last panel. Public employee unions do not simply lobby for greater benefits for their own members, but for the expansion of government on all levels. Was there any greater supporter of President Obama and Obamacare than the public employee unions? When the healthcare industry is fully nationalized, it will add some 15% of the government share of GDP, actually somewhat less than that, since the industry is already half nationalized by way of Medicare and Medicaid. And once the federal government is the employer, it will be that much easier to organize the unorganized healthcare workers. Anyway, that's the background or the history of public sector employee unionism. But I think it's fairly obvious from a constitutional point that this situation can't go on forever if the United States is going to remain a constitutional republic. As FDR himself recognized, the fundamental question in the debate over public sector unionism is the question of sovereignty, of really who's going to control the government. As FDR recognized, if there's a public sector union that is compelling the government to bargain, then that union must be the sovereign power itself. And I think if you look at the looming anarchy that we see in Greece today, that is the logical outcome or the logical result of the kind of anarcho-syndicalism that is really built into the ideology of unionism and public sector unionism, especially. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That's refreshing to hear that Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Coolidge, even Woodrow Wilson and FDR spoke strongly. They strongly opposed public sector unionism. Thanks for that talk on the history of public sector unionism. Our next speaker is Chuck Baird, whose talk will be on the political economy of government sector unionism. And Chuck received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in 1968. Chuck says he spent the next 5 years on the faculty at UCLA really learning economics from his colleague Armin Alkian. He was professor of economics at California State University at East Bay from 1973 until his retirement in 2007. He has been a visiting professor at Stanford University and also at universities in South Africa and in Guatemala. Chuck is a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, and he has served there as vice president and also as a member of the board of directors. He is a quarterly columnist, that is 4 times a year, for the magazine The Freeman. And The Freeman, of course, elevates free market principles and is published by the Foundation for Economic Education. Chuck Baird has published 4 textbooks, all of which went into a second edition. That's important because it just wasn't his students having to buy the book. Other professors also liked the books and sent them into second edition. Chuck has published 9 public policy monographs, over 90 articles in various journals and magazines. His research specialty is in law and economics of labor relations. He has also written on environmentalism, the tax system, and the Austrian School of Economics. Please welcome Chuck Baird.
Well, thank you, Bert, for that very kind introduction. As you see on the screen, that's the last time I'm going to turn because now I know it's up there, so I can just look at this one. My title is The Political Economy of Government Sector Unionism, notwithstanding that my assignment was to talk about the economics of public sector unionism. So I need to explain why I'm talking about political economy. Politics and economics are simply inextricably intertwined in government sector unionism. As Justice Lewis Powell observed in the Abood case, Abood versus Detroit Board of Education in 1977, he says the ultimate objective of a union in the public sector, like that of a political party, is to influence public decision-making in accordance with the views and perceived interests of its membership, and so on. And then that last sentence, in that second paragraph, collective bargaining in the public sector is political in any meaningful sense of the term. You simply cannot separate politics and economics when it comes to government sector unionism. Now, why do I say government sector unionism instead of public sector unionism? Well, because I remember that Milton Friedman always admonished people to talk about government schools rather than public schools. So following that lead, which is always a good lead to follow, it is government sector, not public sector unions, I think, that is the more appropriate label for them. And they are government employees, not public employees, and much less is it reasonable to talk about most of them as public servants. So I have an acronym for government employee unions, GEU, and the plural GEUs, which I will use in my remarks to come. But let's look at some tables. All of my data from these tables, behind these tables, come from a website called unionstats.com, available at the click, at a simple click. The charts aren't there, but the data are there. And of course, I generated these charts using Excel. So you can see the top line there is government union density from 1983 to 2010. Now, what do I mean by density? It's the percent of, in this case, government workers, all three levels, excluding the post office. Post office employees are not included in this data. But it's the percent of government employees at all three levels of government who are government union members. That's what density is, the percent of workers who are government union members. Now, we'll see a little bit later that it's not just government union members who fall under the coercion of government sector collective bargaining, because there are a lot of people who are forced to accept the representation services of government unions who have simply chosen not to be members. But I'll get to that point a little bit later. And we can see in this chart that government sector unionism since 1983. And 1983 is the first date where they began to build a consistent data set on union densities, both private and government. So the government density has fluctuated between 35 and 40. The bottom line is the private sector union density, and that has been steadily declining since 1983. Actually, it's been declining for longer than that, because the peak was around the mid-1950s at 35%. But it has been steadily falling ever since. And in 2010, the last year for which we have data, 6.9% of private sector workers were union members. Only 6.9%. That's roughly what the private sector union density was prior to the adoption of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. So, as we cast about for something about which to be optimistic, there's one for you. Now, I disaggregated the government figures into local, which is the top yellow line. You see, local government employees, we're talking primarily government school teachers, government school teachers, firefighters, and cops, mainly. There are others, but those are the three big groups. That's fluctuated between 40 and 45% over that time interval. State employees, like state university employees, which I used to be that kind of animal. And also I'm getting quite a pension for having done that, for having put up with such excruciating pain. But state employees, over that interval, density 30%, give or take. And then the bottom one is federal civilian employees. The military aren't unionized at all, thank God for that, excluding the post office. And that has been fluctuating between 20 and 15% over that period of time. So you see, the only area in which there is any decline in unionism is the private sector, and the reason for that, of course, is that in the private sector, employers have to face competition, and they can't afford to take cost increases, give wage increases that have the effect of raising unit labor costs, and simply absorb it. They can't pass it forward to consumers because of competition, and the profit margins are already low enough because of competition. So there's a big, well-founded, well-reasoned resistance amongst employers to unionization in the private sector. That's not true in the government sector, as we'll see in a minute. Now, this statistic has already been alluded to. Paul alluded to it. This is the percent of all union workers, government and private, who are government union workers. And notice, starting in 2009, but for both 2009 and 2010, that's over 50%. The union movement, and by the way, it is a union movement, not a labor movement, Labor is a much bigger set than union workers. In 2010, that figure was 52%. And we'll see what the percent rate is when the data come out, and that will be in January for 2011. Now, I referred earlier to this difference between the percent of workers who are members, that's that bottom red area, as opposed to that top line, the percent of government workers who are covered by collective bargaining agreements with government unions. There's a difference there. And you can see it's a rather large difference over time, although it seems to be narrowing. I take that as one indication of the extent to which government is violating workers' freedom of association. In principle, I have no objection, especially in the private sector, to any private worker who wants to be a union member being a union member. I can't object to that. And if an employer wants to bargain with a union who is representing a number of voluntary employees, so be it. It's none of my business. But the whole principle, the key principle of the Wagner Act, Section 9A of the Wagner Act, exclusive representation. There's an election, and a 50% plus one vote to unionize. Then all of the workers will be bargained for by that winning union, not just the members, all of them. It's winner-take-all monopoly bargaining. And that blue area represents that a very important difference. I'm working on forced association. I'm doing a paper for the upcoming API conference in Las Vegas in April. And so I've become very interested in this question of forced association. Now, I want to go quickly through a public choice analysis of government employee unions. Basic principle of public choice analysis is that you can get away with a whole lot when there are focused benefits and diffuse costs. During the Wisconsin brouhaha earlier this year, we were treated to the spectacle of government employees saying, "Raise my taxes," right? And people would say, well, gee, why would they say that? Well, it's obvious because, sure, they're paying taxes along with everybody else, but they get back a hugely disproportionate set of benefits. Gordon Tullock illustrated this by his favorite law, which is this. Suppose there's a law passed imposing a $1 a year per person Tullock tax on everybody, and that the proceeds of the Tullock tax be turned over to Tullock. Boy, Tullock would love that, right? And $1 a year? You know, who cares? Gordon's a pretty nice guy. So you might say, who cares? And even people who don't know him, it's de minimis, too much to worry about. But that's focusing benefits on the relative few at the expense of a great many, but on a per-person basis, those costs are low. A couple of other principles are important in this consideration. Rational abstention. Why is the participation rate in elections lower than a lot of people would like it to be? Well, consider what the benefits are of voting. What benefit is it to me of casting a vote if it doesn't change the outcome? It may make me feel good, my civic duty. But it's a very small benefit if I can't change the outcome. And what's the probability that I can change the outcome? My one vote. Insignificantly different from zero. So the benefits of voting appear to be very small, but their costs are very real. You have to register, you have to queue up, you have to use gasoline or a postage stamp. Next to the benefits, those costs are huge. And so a lot of people rationally choose to abstain from voting. But as I say, civic duty sometimes overcomes that. People's view of what their civic duty is sometimes will overcome that. But then there's another problem, and that's rational ignorance. A lot of people cast uninformed votes. They don't pay attention. Why? Because their vote doesn't affect the outcome unless it causes a tie or breaks a tie. And again, the probability of that, the ex-ante probability of that is negligible. But it costs a lot to become informed. You have to pay attention. You have to weigh the pros and cons of the various issues and candidates. Why bother? Instead, why not just toss a coin in deciding how to vote, rather than taking on the cost of becoming informed? When you buy a new car, you're very careful about that car because your decision determines the outcome. When you vote, you're less careful because your decision does not determine the outcome. On the other hand, organized interests, about whom I will have much to say just now, have a keen incentive to vote. Indeed, they go door to door, pull people out, tell them to vote early and often, and work very hard to get their way. Now, there is in public choice what is called the iron triangle model. I have to quickly go over this. There are politicians, there are special interest groups like unions, and there are bureaucrats or government employees. There's an exchange between politicians and special interest groups. Politicians want to get elected and stay elected. Special interest groups want rents. They want favors from the politicians. And so they enter into that very comfortable exchange. There's another exchange between politicians and government employees. Government employees want bigger budgets, more perks, more power. And so what's their exchange with the politicians? Well, the politicians say to the government employees, we'll pad your budgets, and in exchange, you keep our special interest groups happy. Okay? There's an iron triangle for each special interest group. But look, with government employee unions, what does the iron triangle become? The government employees and the interest groups, they converge. They are the GEUs, the GEUs, and they form, the iron triangle collapses into the handle of an iron dagger. As I would say, with the taxpayers on the outside of the process who have to pay the bills, and here comes the dagger. Sorry for that. Now, forced campaign contributions is another issue. Government sector pay comes from all taxpayers. Some of that pay is taken from government employees for union dues. GEU bosses spend large portions of union dues to elect big government politicians. So, all taxpayers, even those who favor small government, are forced to support big government politicians. The Jim Shirk at the Heritage Foundation, sorry? Oh, a Hillsdale graduate. Okay, that must have been Larry. Right. Yeah, right. Jim Shirk put this together, this chart showing the importance of contributions and special interest groups to keep the politicians happy. 3 of the 5 top in the 2009 to 10 election cycle were the American Federation of State Government and Municipal Employees, the service employees, the notorious Service Employees International, and of course, the one that everybody loves, especially if you have children in school, the National Education Association. Now, very quickly here, the power of monopoly is a big reason why government employee unions are much more successful than private sector unions. Government agencies do not have to compete with private sector providers. Therefore, cost increases due to government sector collective bargaining can be pushed forward to the customers. Who are the customers? The taxpayers. It's not legal to refuse to pay. In the private sector, we as customers have all kinds of alternatives. We can go to alternative suppliers. We can decide not to buy at all. And therefore, in the private sector, there really are two sides to the collective bargaining table. The private sector employer is playing with his own money. He's got his residual claim at stake. There's a contrary interest on the other side, and they work it out. But in the government sector, there are no two sides to the collective bargaining table. They're on the same side. They have a common interest, and that is to pick the pocket of taxpayers. Now, there are a couple of empirical studies I want to cite here. Chris Edwards at Cato, in the Cato Journal, Winter 2010, finds that the state and local compensation exceeds comparable private sector compensation by 45%. Jim Shirk again finds that for federal compensation, the margin is 30 to 40%. And look at this. How about job security, right? This is the layoffs and discharges as a percent of total employment. That's the power of monopoly, when you don't have to face competition. And lastly, I see my time is running out here. James Otis is famous. He was a colonial Massachusetts politician, is famous for coining the term, at least in the United States or in the colonies, taxation without representation is tyranny, and that gave rise to the Boston Tea Party of 1773. Taxes, indeed, are supposed to be decided by elected legislators and elected executives. The process is supposed to be open, but taxpayers are not represented at the government sector collective bargaining table. The bureaucrats sitting across the table from the GEUs do not represent taxpayers. They have a common interest to pick the pockets of taxpayers for bigger budgets, more life-arranging power, more income, more and better perks, speaking of which is the official time, the time that you get off on pay, on the ticket, while doing union work. And Competitive Enterprise Institute tells us that amounted to, in 2009 alone, $129,100,798. That seems a little too precise for an estimate, but nevertheless, it gives you the ballpark. And then finally, mandatory good faith bargaining. What is the significance of this when it comes to government sector unions? Mandatory good faith bargaining in the private sector means the private employer and the union must bargain. If one wants to bargain about something, unless it's something illegal, if one wants to bargain about something, the other has to, and it has to be good faith bargaining. That means they have to compromise. In the government sector, that means that the government employee unions get an effective veto power because whoever's bargaining with them must compromise with them. Nothing can happen without their approval. So they become an illicit fourth branch of government. And my time has run out. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chuck. It's good to be reminded of that incredible growth, that remarkable growth of public sector unions. And if you look at the record of the private sector unions, right, they started most heavily in the late 1930s with, especially in the auto industry, with the UAW, but also the Steel Workers Union and the Rubber Workers Union. And it's not exactly a pleasant history when you consider that 2 generations later, the industries which were represented by those unions were completely run out of business, or at least almost run out of business here in the United States. Our last speaker today is Stephen Greenhut, and his topic is the politics of public sector unions. Stephen Greenhut works for the Pacific Research Institute. There at the Pacific Research Institute, Stephen is the director of the Journalism Center, which was launched in January of 2010 to provide in-depth news coverage of California government. The Journalism Center focuses on uncovering waste, fraud, and misuse of taxpayer dollars. I repeat, the Journalism Center focuses on uncovering waste, fraud, and the misuse of taxpayer dollars. Actually, I just met Steve before. That's fine, Steve. I just met Steve before our panel here, and I asked him, did you need to get out the big microscope to uncover this waste, fraud, and misuse of taxpayer dollars? And he assured me it was right there, and he reports it on their website at calwatchdog.com. It's one of the most influential sites on political news in California. Stephen writes a column for several newspapers, including the Orange County Register, the San Francisco Examiner, and Human Events. He is a contributor to City Journal California, and Stephen is the author of 2 books. In 2004, he wrote his book, Abuse of Power: How the Government Misuses Eminent Domain. His new book is on public sector unions. It is entitled Plunder. He felt we needed a subtitle, which was How Public Employee Unions Are Raiding Treasuries, Controlling Our Lives, and Bankrupting the Nation. Stephen graduated from George Washington University and is married and has 3 daughters. Won't you please welcome Stephen Greenhut?
Yeah, I always say my subtly titled book, Plunder. In fact, one of the editors she was editing it, and she found something she thought would be offensive. I'm like, if they get that far in the book and aren't offended, I'm not changing it. Chuck was talking earlier about, the Milton Friedman calling things government rather than public sector, which I like. Our original publisher at the Orange County Register went them one better. Instead of calling it the public schools or the government schools, he called them the gun run schools. So now I refer to the force-based community whenever I discuss public sector. Well, a government official sits in his office, finds a lamp in an old filing cabinet, rubs it, and a genie appears. This genie's mindful of our 15-minute limit here, so the genie gives only 2 wishes. The first, this government employee wants to be on an island where beautiful women, the real joke said nymphomaniacs, but this is a nice Christian group, say where beautiful women reside. Poof, he was there. Second and final wish, I wish I never had to work again. Poof, he was back in his government office. And so it, well, in reality, he could have stayed on at the island, and at least if he were a California state employee, and received his 6-figure cost of living adjusted pension check for him and the beautiful woman of his choice until death do they part. There's a new, this is for real, a new actuarial term. It's called the Viagra effect. Government employees, especially in the public safety, and remember, public safety is this ever-expanding category. It's not just police, fire, prison guards. It's billboard inspectors, milk inspectors, cooks in prisons. It's like rust that never sleeps. Anyway, they're retiring so young and then marrying people who are that much younger that the actuaries actually have to take that into account as they're figuring out this massive pension debt that we're all stuck paying for. Well, there is good news, and consider I'm from California, so this is good news. We're running out of money, and running out of money focuses the mind. So, I wrote my piece that I'm sure will be posted on regarding this conference here. But as I was flying over here yesterday, I learned that Governor Brown was introducing a new pension reform. So this morning I got up and I took a look and I changed it. It actually isn't a bad pension reform proposal. So this governor who was elected with $30 million, record-setting $30 million in independent expenditures from the public sector unions, and he's done pretty much everything they wanted, although he did veto a bill that would have unionized child care workers, babysitters, so there's even too much for him. His plan is okay. I don't think it'll go anywhere in our union-dominated legislature. But the basic issues are we're running out of money, it's a huge financial problem, obviously. here's an issue I like to talk about. It's not fair. I mean, why do those of us who work in the private sector have to retire 20 years later and with a third of the amount of our public sector colleagues? That's not a really fair system. And one thing, too, that's interesting is because public sector employees are on a defined contribution system with the promises backed by taxpayers, they're really not. They don't care that much about the ongoing economy because they're not tied to it. If my 401k plan goes up, I make more. If it goes down, I make less. It doesn't matter if you're a government employee. You get the same formula no matter what. It doesn't matter what the economy does. That's not really healthy, I don't think. It kind of makes our public servants the masters. Okay, it's depleting public services. This is an argument I make in a blue state like California to liberals. We're stuck dealing with a lot of liberals who think unions are good, and we just have to make this argument that, you know what, it's destroying the public services you care about. We can argue over how big government should be another time, but do you really think, would you really rather close the park so that you can pay retired police captains who are off in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, $300,000 a year? Okay, it's also distorting the nature of our society. Public sector unions provide a one-way ratchet for more government. And it's also, the unions are distorting accountability. A lot of what I learned on the issue was when I was a columnist at the Orange County Register covering local government in a solid Republican county, and Orange County, obviously, and watching, it didn't matter. Republicans were expanding pensions retroactively. The unions were covering up for the worst offenders in their midst. So these are the things that have to drive change at some point. Now, when I said before California unions own the legislature, that's not really fair. They are the legislature. The Assembly Speaker, John Perez, is best known as a United Food and Commercial Workers organizer who led the Southern California grocery strikes. And Darrell Steinberg's the Senate Pro Tem is a former SEIU attorney. So they think like unions, right? It's not just that they're beholden to unions, they are the unions. So what hope do we have? So our only hope seems to be a very flawed progressive era system known as the initiative and referendum. So in last November's election, there were 9 pension reform initiatives. Not all of them, they weren't all in conservative areas, and 8 of them passed. The only one that did not pass was the one in San Francisco, and that came fairly close. And in San Francisco, Jeff Adachi, the public defender, who is a progressive Democrat, and actually a good guy, he's serious about reform, and he's back again with a new initiative. And of course, the city has been playing all sorts of games to try to undermine that initiative. He's also running for mayor. Of course, it's San Francisco. He's not going to win. Neither is the initiative. But it's a good effort. Okay, how bad are things? Well, according to Stanford University, we have a $500 billion unfunded liability. And you'll find everything dealing with pensions, there are these terms that are meant to make your eyes glaze over. What's an unfunded liability? Well, it's a debt that's going to have to be paid. So I get from unions a lot, they say, well, it's not a real debt because, it's calculated based on rates of return. Say, okay, it's not a real debt, then let's not pay your pensions. It's not a real obligation. Whoa. So they're not really, they back away from that argument fairly quickly. In the city of Vallejo, which went bankrupt, and we're probably going to see more bankruptcies coming down the pike, they were paying police captain total benefit package of $300,000. Vallejo, which believe me needs a police service, has been warning its residents not to use the 911 system judiciously. In other words, don't call unless Charles Manson's at the door. And they cut their I'm always accused of being anti-public safety. Well, because of the ridiculous pay and benefit packages, they're the ones who are cutting the police force by a third and shutting down fire stations. I'm just not for this kind of abuse. So Vallejo is, now of course, Vallejo, the city council is dominated by union members. It's an old port city, so they went bankrupt and they came out of it without really touching their pensions. So go figure, it's not a cure-all. The $100,000 pension club has 15,000 members, and it's growing by about 40% each year. The closer you get, the more recent retirees obviously are retiring with the higher amounts. I hear a lot from the unions will always say, well, the average Mr. Greenhut doesn't understand that the average pension is only $27,000. Well, yeah, that goes back, to people who retired in the Pleistocene era and who maybe, it's an average. It includes everybody, people who've only worked a short period of time. And in recent retirees, the figure's somewhere in the 60s, and that's cost of living adjusted. The average retirement package for a California Highway Patrol who retired in the last couple of years and worked at least 20 years is $98,000. So we wonder why there's a unfunded pension problem. Okay, the disabilities. According to the Sacramento Bee, that notorious right-wing newspaper, 82% of the California Highway Patrol have retired with a disabling injury. Miraculously, they discover that their back aches or irritable bowel syndrome is one of the most popular ones, exactly a year before retirement, and then that protects 50% of their retirement from taxes, and they get an extra year off. And I still have a standing offer, and this only applies to California. If you can find a police chief in the last 10 years who retired not on a disability, I'll buy you a pretty good lunch. And it just doesn't happen. I remember one down in Irvine who dropped a briefcase on his toe and was disabled. When I worked at the newspaper, I helped chase a disabled police officer out of state. Yeah, he was applying for other police chief jobs while he was disabled, and he told me he was disabled only from that one particular job. Okay, so. Now, public safety, and I think we need another term for public safety, because that just sounds, who's against public safety? They retire with 3% at 50, that's the typical retirement. That means 90% of your final year's pay before all the pension spiking gimmicks. The Bee just had a story about how public employees, how government employees, state workers were retiring and then cashing in their unused vacation and even sometimes sick leave as much as $800,000 they take away. Most people in the private sector don't even have savings of that much for their entire retirement. There are all sorts of double-dipping scams, airtime where you buy additional retirement for pennies on the dollar. Of course, they pay pennies, we pay the dollars. That's one of the things that Governor Brown is targeting. Then there are the cancer presumptions, which keep cancer and heart attack presumptions. If you or I get cancer or heart attacks, it's assumed, in my case, to be my lifestyle of eating donuts and drinking beer and not exercising. If you happen to be a retired CHP officer, it's presumed to be on the job related, and then that opens a whole store of benefits that we get to pay for. Anyway, the Sacramento Bee again, and I like to quote them. They do a good job covering this issue, but they're a liberal paper, so I'm not getting this. This isn't from the right-wing press, as I get accused of. But governments have become pension providers that provide services on the side. What does that say about our society? I mean, that's pretty depressing. Then there are this terrible entitlement mentality that has seeped in. I know this shocks you within the government employees. This is a great example. I wrote about this for the LA Times. The city of Alameda, right next to Oakland, a man wades into the water, 60-degree water, he's going to commit suicide. Dozens of police and firefighters show up. They stand around, they watch. He drowns. They don't go in and get the body. A bystander goes and gets the body. They interview the police and fire. They say, well, we didn't have the proper cold water training. Well, I don't usually go swimming in a San Francisco Bay in 60 degrees water, but I'm sorry, that's not life-threatening. And anyway, one of the TV stations interviewed this guy, Richie Zombek. I think we need to name names whenever possible. He's the division chief of Alameda, and they asked him whether he would go and save a child who was drowning in the same situation. And he gave a bureaucratic answer that was, no, not if I were on duty, but if I were off duty, I'd know what to do. Well, in my thinking, if we're safer with these guys being off duty than we are when they're being on duty, then we ought to disband all these departments. And this isn't, I've written about this a bit. This is not uncommon as the problem. But I just read the other day that, don't worry about it, the Alameda Fire Department just bought new boats. So we are safe indeed. Then I love, everything about government is hilarious if it weren't depressing. The hypocrisy angle is just too much to take. I mean, I think I could put up with the corruption, the greed, the waste, the unfairness, all the horrible things government does. If they just wouldn't lecture us and pretend that they're better than us, I'll make that deal. And CalPERS, the California Public Employee Retirement System, which as a journalist I call it the gift that keeps on giving, they assume a rate of return of 7.75%. Now, if I could get a rate of return of that, I'm just putting my money there, and at least I'll have some semblance of a retirement. And they blast me. They have a whole CalPERS response, and they've responded to some of my pieces, so to speak. And then, but when our money's at stake, 7.75%. In other words, they guess that that's the rate of return, and that's how they base the retirements based on this money coming in at that rate. Well, a number of localities, especially in Orange County, have been sick of the corruption scandals at CalPERS and so forth, and they want out of the CalPERS system and go into another system. Well, CalPERS will pay them a whopping 3.8% when its own money's at stake. And CalPERS blasts Stanford, which used a 4.1%. So you can see the hypocrisy there. And of course, there are all these pay-for-play scandals. They have this diversity measure that I had a hilarious time with. They're basically preaching about diversity to everybody else. Well, I went and I linked to my article to their boards about board diversity on private companies. And being a bald, overweight white guy, you can guess who's on their board. But it's just a matter of why they're lecturing us about that sort of thing when they have amazing problems of their own. Anyway, numbers are on our side. I had this debate with this union official, a nice guy, and after the debate, and he said, well, my friend said you beat me, whatever. I said, well, that's because you're wrong. He goes, well, I have a tougher side of the argument. Well, in my view, if you're getting the tougher side of the argument, then you're wrong, and you ought to change your argument. But that's why I love the quote from Daniel Hannan last night, the Upton Sinclair quote. It's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary is dependent on him not understanding it. And that's the problem we're going against. And that's what we have to fight against. And we also have to fight against these awful lies that, I know that shocks you, unions lying. And I've seen unions at boards of supervisors. They promise that so-and-so retroactive pension increase will not affect the budget at all, won't affect the budget at all. And I've watched good Republicans say, okay, and vote for that thing. As soon as it's voted for, the courts have ruled that's an ironclad legal promise. And then literally on the last one, it was 3 weeks later, we learned that it increased the unfunded liability by $300 million, which is a lot of money in a county. And then, anyway, but they don't care. They don't care. They lied. They got what they want. Well, another lie, and this is the most fun one that I've had debunking, is hear it all the time from union officials. We die early, especially the public safety ones. They say we die 3 to 5 years after we retire. That's why we get these enormous pensions. Well, if that were true, I mean, just think about it. We wouldn't have a large unfunded liability problem. But as I always say, I wish a long and healthy life for everybody. However, I went and did the research. In CalPERS, they provided me their data, and they also provided me a report debunking it. They have good actuarial data. They're not so good on the corporate ethics, but they've got good data. And it turns out that the longest living category of employee of any type is a police officer, followed closely behind by a firefighter, and they live to be in their mid-80s. So it's not exactly true. Also, I referred to their whole idea about $27,000 a year. It's nonsense. But this criticism, they say, is scapegoating. They have a website, Don't Scapegoat Us, they being some of the union activists, Don't Scapegoat Us. My mom calls me a couple months ago, and she says, Steve, you're on television. And I'm like, wow, what station? She goes, MSNBC. I'm like, wow, I've never been on MSNBC. I better take a look. And they had the new International Firefighter Union ad. They had me saying that firefighters don't really have all that much to do. And then they cut to a clip of firefighters pulling, dying people out of buildings. And I couldn't stop laughing. And the reason is they have nothing left other than emotionalism and using me on an ad. I had a firefighter union guy. He comes in when I worked at the Register. He was furious. He wanted a correction, and my editor's like, don't mention the word correction in front of an editor. She's like, what's up? And the guy says, Steve reported that we were paid for sleeping, and that's not true. And I'm like, well, it isn't. He goes, we're paid while sleeping. Correction. Yeah, correction granted, right? I gladly did that correction. So I couldn't wait. And anyway, it's a little funny, but it's pretty sad. I mean, when we look, I remember on the Stossel show, John Stossel, he shows what public employees are doing to the public services. And this is where we make common cause with honest progressives. Granted, that might be an oxymoron, but I know a few. He shows a sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11, with little boxes and arrows, showing what it takes to fire a teacher, right? And the LA Times, in fact, did a whole front page series on saying that the LAUSD doesn't even try to fire incompetent teachers. But if you're credibly accused of committing a crime, it can take 12 years. They put you in rubber rooms, blah, blah, blah. Well, anyway, Stossel, we get to the end of it, and the audience is laughing. And then he lets go, and 4 more sheets fall to the floor. Now, I could imagine if I couldn't get rid of reporters who were incompetent. I mean, what kind of news service would I have? I mean, think of the areas, I mean, in your life where you work. How would you have, and this is how we educate our kids. I mean, God, it's scary. So we can't fire them. There's not much accountability. I could go on. I don't have much time left, but about some of the police abuse issues I covered as a newspaper guy, and what I saw, it was horrendous. And because the unions stand up for the worst. And I wanted to mention, we're talking about the whole thing of the government's negotiating on both sides of the table. At the local level, it's really bad. And in many cases, the city employees negotiating with the unions are members of the very union they're negotiating against. Now, who negotiates on behalf of the taxpayers? And the city council has been elected with the help of the same unions. What do you think's going to happen? This is how people always want to know how it happened. Well, this is how it happened. Well, we weren't paying attention. 9/11 also was terrible for many reasons, but this was one thing that has really been harmful. During almost many salary negotiations with public safety officials since then, they refer to 9/11, and officials don't want to go up against that. But we must confront this. The fact that even Governor Brown is proposing something that's perfectly reasonable, doesn't go far enough, but it's good. We have to deal with current employees. I'm not saying retroactively remove their pensions, but starting tomorrow, start earning at a lower rate, like it's happened in the private sector, because just changes for new hires, that's not going to fix the whole problem. And the final point is the unions are going to come after us full bore, no matter what, for any minor reform. And I've had union officials tell me that. I'm like, why did you run that campaign? You know you weren't going to win. He said, because we wanted to show our members. We wanted to flex our muscle. So we might as well go for the gusto. We may as well go for the real reform. Any reform that doesn't take on the unions head on isn't going to be anything worth doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, we've had a good series of talks on public sector unions. We've had Paul with the history of public sector unions, and Charles emphasizing more the economics of public sector unions, and now the politics with Stephen. And we have some time for questions. We have perhaps as much as 12 to 14 minutes for questions. And so why don't we open it up to those of you in the audience? Okay.
Good afternoon.
And state who your question is for.
Well, it's not quite a question. I want to bring up a point that Charlie mentioned about unionizing. You know, it takes 50% plus one person for a facility or factory to unionize. And that facility or factory has to represent all workers, whether one's join the union or do not join the union. One point I want to emphasize is in the right-to-work state, you do not have to join your union, as Chuck mentioned, and they have to represent you. But in a non-right-to-work state, you still don't have to join the union, but they're going to take the dues out of your paycheck anyway. So you'll have no obligation, you have no reasoning there. They're going to take that union dues out of your paycheck on a non-right-to-work state. Thank God I've lived in right-to-work states. I am a retired air traffic controller, if that brings up a point. And I emphasize the word retired, not fired. I went through that PATCO scenario, and I've seen friends turn against me because I never joined the union, and I figured I had a real good job without a college education. I wasn't about to give that up because of these fellow employees who I later turn around and call them thugs, try to get me to join the union. In fact, I seen him laugh in President Reagan's face. He basically said, okay, you guys, I'll give you 48 hours to get your butts back to work or you're fired. They didn't believe him. I've seen 49 out of 58 air traffic controllers at my facility get fired. They don't believe President Reagan. Of course, like I said, I wasn't union myself. After that, because we were so short of controllers, I worked overtime for about a year and a half. You know, in government, and no 40 hours is time and a half. I worked 60 hours a week for about a year and a half. You do the math. I cried all the way to the bank. Thank you.
I could say, at least in theory, even in compulsory union states, you're supposed to be entitled to a refund of those parts of the dues that you pay that don't go for actual organizing and bargaining matters. The political spending that these unions do. I'm a member of the Amalgamated Meat Cutters because I worked at a supermarket in New York when I was in high school and in college. And the thing that annoyed me the most about that was the propaganda that my dues were going to support against the Reagan administration. Now, it's a very difficult matter to actually recover those non-economic payments, but at least in the law is, that's, Chuck, you might know this better than I do.
That's correct. No person who is represented by a union and who is not a member can be forced to pay full union dues. They have to pay what is called an agency fee for the representation services, and it's supposed to be just for representation services, not for anything that the union does in politics, not even for organizing. That's not a chargeable expense under the Supreme Court Beck decision in 1988.
Unions make it as difficult as possible to, when people try to get their money returned and they understate it, and that's why the paycheck protection is one alternative to make it an opt-in rather than an opt-out.
Okay. Yeah, Jerry, go ahead.
Couple of points. Okay. Is it on? Okay. A couple of observations. We see that the private sector union membership is declining, but to what extent are they being successful in getting free trade agreements enacted that require the other countries to provide health care, housing, and all the other things that workers have here in order to raise the cost of doing business over there, and therefore lessen the desire to move operations overseas? That's question number one. I think I'd probably go to Mr. Moreno. And secondly, why do the police officers and firefighters, safety officers, why do they get a premium when they are working? In other words, they get paid more money than an accountant does, but when they retire, they get 90% of their last pay, and the poor accountant at the same time of year, 30 years, he only gets 65 or 70%. Why is that, and how can we change it?
Go ahead, Paul.
On the globalization point, there is a lot of talk from union organizers about that, but the actual prospects of global organizing a global labor market are pretty not likely to change things. What they are doing, though, is a lot of private sector unions are beginning to organize in the public sector. There's a movement to organize, for instance, graduate student teaching assistants who can make some claim to being exploited. But in any case, the most active union organizing them is the United Auto Workers. So you may be in a situation where one day the majority of United Auto Workers unions are not auto workers, but have gone into the growth fields, which are the public sectors, after they've killed their private sector industries.
I'd like to comment on one other quirk in the law that has to do with private colleges and universities like Hillsdale. There's a Supreme Court decision that says faculty at private colleges and universities are supervisors/managers, and therefore, under the National Labor Relations Act, are not subject to unionization. In the government sector, of course, that's an entirely different body of law. But when it comes to the private sector, higher education, faculty union, there can never be mandatory good faith bargaining with exclusive bargaining agents. It's simply impossible for that to be forced on a president. Now, a president who's a little weak on the subject, like Larry Arnn, may foolishly say agree to recognize the union for the faculty. He can do that, right? But I'm sure he and any other sensible CEO of a college or university would never enter into such agreement. Therefore, they don't have to worry about unionization of faculty.
On the question about public safety, I mean, elected officials have decided that first responders, because their jobs are arguably more dangerous and are certainly are in some cases, get a higher amount. And then of course the public safety unions have used that to guilt people, especially since 9/11, into making the disparity ever bigger and expanding the categories. I always tell the public safety officials I argue with, my roofer doesn't get 3% at 50, and he's got a far more dangerous job, and they don't really like that. And then what they say is, well, you don't want 65-year-old cops chasing down criminals. I'm like, well, in reality, most of those jobs are bureaucratic investigation jobs. I'm not trying to diminish the jobs or anything. It's just that you don't really have 65-year-old cops chasing down criminals. Just like in the newspaper business, we don't have 50-something editors chasing down stories. They're the ones at the desk. So I understand the disparity to a degree, but I don't understand how it's gotten way out of hand, and it's politics.
I got a question just out of curiosity. The Bible says in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 5, knowledge is power. And in verse 6, it says, when you go to battle, you better have counsel. So I'm thinking about citizens' knowledge and citizens' counsel. How do we get the government to be transparent? And I know the media is the fifth branch of the government. So can you enlighten us on that?
Did you have anybody in particular you were addressing that to? Okay, go ahead. Or Paul, would you like to?
Well, I guess that's, Steve, that's your job.
Well, I think
transparency and information.
I think media coverage has gotten
better.
better. I think media coverage of this issue is fabulous, and I think part of the reason is a lot of editors are my age. They realize, hey, we'd be retired and living in the Cayman Islands if I were a public employee. It's a wide open media world now, and there are a lot more. And I think the coverage has been much better on these issues. But it's just hard breaking the power of the unions. I mean, we can only report on things. We can't, make anyone do anything.
The most pressing transparency issue, as I very hastily tried to explain in my presentation in government sector unionism, is this bargaining in secret. Good faith bargaining is always in secret. The public has no access, has no voice. And in that bargaining process, of course, as I said, the government unions, the employing bureaucrats have to make concessions to the government unions, or nothing happens. That is the most clandestine way in which taxpayer burdens are increased in this country, in my opinion.
That's a really great point. From what I remember covering local government, this would always happen, and this is the way it was done. The unions would negotiate a deal with the city. It was done in closed session, which was allowed under the Brown Act, our open meetings law, because it was a negotiation. They'd come to terms with the deal. They'd send the deal to the unions. Still, nobody in the public has yet to be notified even of what the meeting was about. Then they'd come to a deal. Everyone would have a deal, and then they would drop it Thursday before the Tuesday council meeting in a way that nobody in the right mind would even know. The council meeting comes on Tuesday, the vote happens by Thursday, everyone's kind of realizing, hey, what just happened? It's already law.
Our time is up, but I'd like to have a hand for our three panelists.